is that every religious person thinks he has a knockdown argument against atheism. And we've all heard these arguments, and we are going to keep hearing them as long as we call ourselves atheists. We've all heard the argument that the atheist can't prove there is no God. Or as Rick Warren put it when I debated him for Newsweek, a rational person like him doesn't have enough faith to be an atheist. Because the idea that the universe could be created without a creator is the most extravagant faith claim of all. Now, as Richard just pointed out, these arguments are travesties if they're used to defend any specific conception of God. And we all know what to do in this situation. We have Russell's teapot, we have the thousands of dead gods, and now we have a flying spaghetti monster, the non-existence of which can't be proven, and yet the existence of which is, a belief in which is acknowledged to be ridiculous by anyone. The problem is we have to keep having the same argument over and over again. So too with the greatest crimes of the 20th century argument. How many times are we going to have to counter the charge that Hitler, Stalin, and Pol Pot represent the end game of atheism? I got news for you. This meme is not going away. I argued against it in The End of Faith, and it was immediately thrown up at me in reviews of the book as though I had never mentioned it. So I mentioned it again in the afterword to the paperback of The End of Faith, and this did no good whatsoever. So then I brought it up again. At the risk of boring all of you, I brought it up again in Letter to a Christian Nation. And Richard did the same in The God Delusion. And Christopher took a mighty whack at it in God is Not Great. I think this argument will be with us for as long as we call ourselves atheists. And it really convinces people. It really convinces liberals and moderates. It even convinces the occasional atheist. Why should we stand obediently in the space provided? Why should we stand in the space carved out by the conceptual scheme of theistic religion? I mean, it's as though our opponents, before any debate, have drawn the chalk outline of a dead man on the sidewalk, and we just walk up and lie down in it. Instead of doing this, think about what would happen if we simply use words like reason and evidence. Now, what is the argument against reason? It's true that certain people will bite the bullet here and say that reason is itself a problem and the Enlightenment is a failed project, but the truth is, very few people are comfortable admitting to being enemies of reason. Even among fundamentalists, I would say especially among fundamentalists. They imagine themselves to be champions of reason. They think they have very good reasons for believing in God. Nobody wants to believe things on bad evidence. The desire to know what is actually going on in the world is very difficult to argue with. And insofar as we represent merely that desire, we become difficult to argue with. And this desire is not reducible to an interest group. It's not a club, and it's not an affiliation. And I think trying to make it one, or giving the appearance that it is one, necessarily diminishes its power. I just want to rehearse for you what these core beliefs are and what they entail. The belief is that Muhammad got the Quran directly from the Archangel Gabriel in his cave in the 7th century. And it is the perfect word, therefore, of the creator of the universe. I apologize for the cartoonish nature of this image of Muhammad, but quality images are difficult to come by at the moment. Now, the consequence is we have this single book, which is imagined to be the best book on any subject ever written, never to be superseded by any human effort at any point in the future. Now, this is a problem because this is a profoundly mediocre book. Okay? It is dangerous to say this. It is suicidal to say this as a Muslim. It is true. And we have to grapple with this fact. And the idea that this is the best book ever written on any subject can only be maintained in a kind of fantastical intellectual isolation. And this isolation has actually been achieved in the Arab world to an astonishing degree. Some of you probably have heard this fact, but the country of Spain translates more of the world's literature and learning into Spanish every year than the entire Arab world has translated into Arabic since the 9th century. Okay, that's scary. It's scary given that the contents of this book really offers precious little rationale for living in a sane and pluralistic global civilization. What it does give you a rationale for is ceaselessly worshiping the perfect being who has given you this mediocre book. And this is a photo of Muslims in Kashmir worshiping at a shrine believed to contain a single beard hair from the Prophet Muhammad. Now, in showing you this image, I don't actually mean to denigrate the positive emotions that can be associated with this kind of practice. I mean, I think devotion is a positive emotion that we want in our lives. And I certainly don't mean to make light of how difficult life undoubtedly is for Muslims in Kashmir. But it seems to me patently obvious, given the challenges that they face and that we all face in creating a world worth living in, these people have something more important to do than worship the beard hair of a man who may well have been a schizophrenic. And again, when I talk about Islam, one thing I should make perfectly clear, and should have made it clear at the top, I'm talking about the logical and behavioral consequences of ideas. I'm not talking about people. I'm not talking about all Muslims. Not all Muslims are terrorists, obviously. Not all Muslims support terrorism. Not all Muslims take Islam all that seriously. I'm certainly not talking about a race of people. I'm not talking about Arabs. I'm not talking about nationalities or ethnicities. I'm talking about ideas and what people can plausibly do on their basis. And what people do on the basis of these ideas, it turns out to be very bad for women to a remarkable degree and in general. And there really is no basis in Islam to argue that there should be true equality between the sexes. I mean, you can finesse this issue, but what you cannot get is just a clear statement of men and women are equal and have the same moral stature. It's just not true. You have to edit the faith to get that.
And who introduced the idea of God to you?
School.
Rather than parents?
Probably my parents sort of mentioned it in the same sort of breath as Little Red Riding Hood and things like that.
And do you remember believing?
Oh yes, at school I was confirmed into the Church of England.
And you meant it at the time?
Oh yes, at the age of about 12 or 13.
And how do you think that happened? I mean, had you been indoctrinated? Or, I mean, what was it?
Indoctrinated is a strong word, but it had been a central part of my education at school, yes.
I mean, what I mean is, have you come to understand how you had come to believe in something?
Yes, when you're told something by an authority figure, by a teacher, by a vicar, yes, it's not...
You just accept it?
Yes, it's not difficult to understand why that is.
In a way it is, isn't it? I mean, to really believe is to really accept an idea in your mind, isn't it?
Well, yes.
Not just to repeat what you're being told.
No, I mean, I really believe it, and I think people do, and I think that's one of the insidious aspects of it, that the child mind is receptive, perhaps too receptive, but you can see why. It would be a good thing for the child mind to be receptive to whatever the child mind is told by an authoritative adult speaking very seriously. And it's easy to see why all over the world people inherit, not in a genetic sense, in a mimetic sense, inherit the religion of their parents, their grandparents, their school teachers, their priests, and so on. And they really, really do believe it, and that's important to understand. When we castigate terrorists for doing suicide bombings and things like that, you have to understand they really, really believe it. They really believe, as Sam Harris says, they really believe what they say they believe. And it's not surprising that they do, considering that they were taught it. It was rammed down their throats in early childhood.
I mean, you have very controversially before said that believers are victims of their religion.
Yes.
I mean, are you extending that then to terrorists?
Of course.
That they are victims.
Yes. Yes. They really believe it. They honestly, they're sincere. They believe that they're doing the righteous, good thing. And they've been taught that. They are victims, yes.
And so whose fault is that? What are they victims of?
Well, I suppose, I mean, it's tempting to say they're victims of their teachers and priests, but that's probably unfair too, because the teachers and priests themselves were victims in their own childhood. It's a self-repeating process. That's the whole point of mimetics. It just goes on from generation to generation. So perhaps we shouldn't use the word fault. I mean, it's just something that happens, just like genes get passed on. We can break the cycle by counter-education, and that's what I'm trying to do in my life.
Every religious person who takes the Genesis account of creation, say, seriously, 53% of Americans seemingly take it literally, but just even dignifying it as informative. Any person who's doing this is essentially saying to somebody like Stephen Hawking, Stephen, you're a smart guy. I see you got a lot of equations over there, but you essentially don't know enough about cosmology, because here, God did this in 6 days, and then he rested on the seventh, and I don't really, it could be a metaphor, but I don't see you really grappling with the nuances here, and they're essentially saying to someone like Richard Dawkins or Robert Trivers or any evolutionary biologist, they're saying, you're saying all this stuff about DNA and the fossil record and radiocarbon dating, but it says here that man was made in a separate act of creation, and that really we should ponder over that. And I mean, this would be amusing, this kind of covert arrogance, if it were not having such a disastrous effect, if it were not impeding the teaching of science in this country. 30% of biology teachers don't even mention evolution because it is such a hassle to deal with the religious lunacy of their students and their parents. I mean, this really is impeding medical research. It really is eroding the prestige of the United States in the eyes of the rest of the world. You saw this recent Republican debate. When asked, how many of you reject evolution? 3 arms go up. I mean, this is flabbergasting. These people are seeking the highest office, not only the highest office in the land, they're seeking more power and responsibility than any person has had in human history. So to wrap up, let me just say that none of what I've just said should be construed as a denial of the importance of ethics in our lives, or even the importance of spiritual experience. You can be someone who's deeply committed to transforming your moment-to-moment perception of the world and use techniques like meditation and fasting, and you can go into a cave for a year and be a mystic if you want to. None of that requires presupposing anything on insufficient evidence. And none of that requires that we lie to ourselves or to our children about our state of knowledge about the world. And the problem I have with religion, both at every point on the spectrum, from moderate to extreme, is that it stands as a permanent denial of the possibility of developing a truly rational, modern, open-ended discussion about the nature of our subjectivity, about the possibility of ethics and spirituality truly in conformity with our rationality as it exists now. Every religious person, every person who's committed to still being a Christian or a Jew or a Buddhist is essentially giving tacit endorsement to the religious divisions in our world, and essentially saying that we need some measure of mythology, we need some measure of fairy tale, we need to pretend on some occasions that we know things we do not know. And it's simply untrue. So I think that's probably enough to get us started. Thank you.
You said there was no evidence of intermediates in evolution, and I told you about 5 fossils.
And what I say, if that were if those were valid, there would be tons of evidence, because there are so many different species that there ought to be tons of evidence, even let's say for 1% of the macro evolution that's taken place, there should be evidence. But there's not even 1%, let alone 10 or 50 or 70%.
There is a massive amount of evidence. You just need to go into the books and go into the museums and look at it. It's there.
Yes, and
you're believing people who are telling you there's only 1%.
Oh, and again, I go back to it's very demeaning to say that we only believe what we believe because we've been told that, and yet we have evolutionary scientists who want to be the ones to tell all of society what is fact and what's not fact, and to censor out information that is inconvenient.
I'm asking you to go and look at the facts. I don't want you to believe me, just go and look at the facts.
Yes, and I have. And again, I go back to let's look at the differences of what your philosophy lives out, the evolutionary philosophy, and how does that end up working out in a society?
Yeah, I've accepted that if we worked out society on Darwinian grounds, it would be a very, very unpleasant right-wing society. I've accepted that.
Well, I don't know right-wing. It seems to be that you fall back on ad hominem, name-calling.
All right, then, free market, ruthless trampling on the poor. That's what it would be like.
What I find interesting, though,
is... We don't want
is
a Darwinian society. I don't want a Darwinian society.
Communism was based on atheistic beliefs and evolutionary beliefs. And communism resulted in a decade that had more deaths, over 100 million deaths committed because of communism, than all the killings combined of every century prior to that. So when you talk about socialism, which is a close cousin to communism, being a better way of life, I look back on what beliefs was communism and socialism based on, and the atheistic belief that human beings are not distinct and should not be respected.
When you say distinct, do you mean distinct from each other, or do you mean when human beings are not distinct from each other? Is that what you mean?
Human beings are created as distinct from one another and should be treated with respect, even if they are not utilitarian, even if they are not able to provide something to society. The atheistic belief, the evolutionary belief, is that you're unnecessary and unneeded if you cannot provide something for society.
That's an extraordinary thing to say. I mean, you equated atheistic with evolutionary. That means that's wiping out most of the bishops. They wouldn't take very kindly to that. I know
I've recognized that there are varying degrees within the evolutionary beliefs. It's the hardcore evolutionists that reject the idea of a creator that then pave the foundation for very brutal societies.
Well, I have accepted that if we were to base our societies on Darwinian principles, they would be brutal, harsh, and unpleasant. I have told you that I want not to live in a Darwinian society. I've suggested to you that it might be a good idea to learn something about Darwinism so as to know what to avoid in setting up society.
And it would be helpful to learn what are the characteristics that make a successful and healthy society. And let's build on those characteristics.
I agree with that, and among those characteristics would be critical thinking, a respect for education, a respect for evidence.
And a respect for human beings.
And a respect for human beings, very much so.
Regardless of whether they can provide for society or provide something to society.
Yes, indeed. That's the essence of the liberal philosophy which I espouse, that human beings should be respected, their health should be taken care of.
Even if they don't have a functioning brain that is conscious.
They should be given, their hospital care should be taken care of by the state. That's a liberal principle which I espouse. It's an un-Darwinian principle.
And see, I believe that it's not a state, because a state is an institution or an entity. It's human beings that provide care for others.
Well, okay, human beings provide care for others. None of that bears on the truth of whether evolution actually happened. And that is a matter of fact. It's like gravity. You can't get away from fact. Study the fact, learn the facts, and then make up the society that you want to live in on the basis of the facts as they are.
Yeah, and the facts that would include what makes the better society is one where there is deep respect for each human being, and a way to inculcate
deep respect for each human being.
And the way to inculcate respect for human beings is by seeing that they were created
So you would you
by a
actually
loving
distort
creator.
the scientific fact in order to create respect?
There's no need to distort, because as I mentioned, science is a technique, a tactic for discovering and unlocking the keys of how this world works. And so we don't need to deny any facts, because the facts end up bearing out our beliefs. So sometimes it takes time for science to catch up with the beliefs that have made the best societies. Sometimes it takes a while for science they may stumble across something and take the wrong interpretation from it and build a philosophy on it, and then later realize, oops, that wasn't correct. So science oftentimes changes its own beliefs based on new evidence that comes forward. But oftentimes what ends up happening is, as science progresses, it backs up the belief that there's an intelligent designer.
Science proceeds by what the philosopher Karl Popper called conjectures and refutations. So, you have an idea, you have a hypothesis, and then you see if you can refute it. And a theory is, I mean, a well-substantiated theory is always one that has yet to be refuted. So the more a theory has been attempted to be refuted and has yet to come through with flying colours, the more accepted it is. And after a point, de facto, it gets called a fact. I mean, the theory that the Earth goes round the Sun is only a theory. It's only a theory, but it's never been refuted, and we all know it never will be refuted. That's how science proceeds. It's conjecture and refutation. That's the state that evolution is in. I mean, it's a bit like the theory that the Earth goes around the Sun. It is only a theory, but to a scientist, that can mean, in this case does mean, that it's never been refuted. And the more it goes on from decade to decade to decade, and is not refuted, the more closely does it approximate to what everybody calls a fact.
Then evolutionists should have no problem with there being questioning of it and
Absolutely not. I mean,
challenging
no.
of it,
You're
and to
right.
be willing to teach the challenges to it, to be willing to talk about the evidence against it. And that's where I find the hardcore evolutionists have a bit of a problem. It's like an oak tree in a storm. Because it is so rigid, it's more likely to then fall and break, whereas those that are more open to being challenged can then bend with the facts that come forward. So that's why what many of us in the United States are arguing for: teach the controversies in the schools. Allow the information that shows the flaws in evolution to be taught. Don't blackball scientists who may not agree wholeheartedly with the hardcore version of evolution to be blackballed out of the profession. Allow people to have enough respect for people to allow them to have all the information so they can make up their own minds.
It's a difficult question, this thing about blackballing. I mean, it's a nasty idea to blackball, of course. I mean, what about somebody who's teaching geography, who believes in the flat Earth? I mean, would you blackball them?
Well, always extreme cases are used. That's not what we're facing here in the United States. What we're facing are scientists who may not agree wholeheartedly with the hardcore view of evolution, who do believe in intelligent design. They're being denied their careers.
Well,
they're being denied. So it's better to argue from the facts of what's happening rather than some hypothetical.
Okay, let's take intelligent design. I mean, the leading intelligent design proponents in this country believe in evolution. They believe that we're cousins of chimpanzees, we're cousins of kangaroos, etc. But what they don't believe is that God is completely absent from the process. So they believe in evolution, but they believe that God, as it were, helped evolution over the difficult jumps. There are some things that they call irreducibly complex, which, and scientists dispute that they're irreducibly complex, but the point is they do believe in evolution. They do believe that we're descended from reptiles, for example.
Well,
it's just that they think that God helped over certain of the difficult stages.
So it would be wonderful to interview them and let them speak themselves, present their information and their evidence.
Yes.
And to show that there are a variety of views. And that's why the hardcore evolutionists should not have a monopoly on what is allowed to be discussed or researched in science.
Would you accept, well, nobody's going to make any restriction on what you're allowed to research, of course.
Well, that's done, of course, through funding, through grants, through positions at universities. There are ways to restrict what can and can't be researched.
I mean, funding of scientific research is always a problem, and all scientists have a time when they grumble about not getting funding. I mean, you do have to, you're competing in a marketplace, and the NSF and other grant-giving bodies have to give money where peer review suggests it's going to be most useful. I mean, that is definitely a problem, of course. Would you accept that what you call teaching the controversy should be done in classes of religion or classes of history of ideas, rather than classes of science?
Teaching the controversy refers to teaching the evidence and the facts that dispute evolution. So it should be taught in the science classes because it's teaching evidence.
Yes, I mean, when I asked you about evidence, you said there are no fossil intermediates, and when I told you about fossil intermediates, you changed the subject. I mean,
no, when I don't change the subject, what I say is that if there were, if there had been evolution from slime to human beings, that there'd be a massive amount of evolution. If there was evidence of going from slime to human beings, there'd be a massive amount of evidence showing interspecies, from one macro species to another. And that's where I find the concept of evolution lacking. And so the burden really is on the evolutionists. Oftentimes it's been thrown back at us that we just need to look at the information. But let me throw it back on you all to say, look, this is what's needed to convince us. So you need to come up with a large amount of evidence to back up this claim that there's been a large progression of macroevolution throughout the years.
Yes. How are we going to make you look at it there? Because, I mean, I've told
you...
Well,
no, we look at it. We look at it. Again, when I go back to... it's easy to blame the other person. To blame by saying that we're ignorant. But what I'm saying to you is if there were enough evidence, it would convince even, it will convince those who are open to the information. There's such a vast number of people in the United States and elsewhere who do believe in an intelligent design, that there's a creator. If there was a vast amount of evidence, solid evidence to back up evolution, that would influence a significant number of the vast number of people who believe in intelligent design.
That sends me close to despair because the evidence is there. I mean, I keep telling you about it. No, just let me tell you some of it. There is evidence for example, the transition from fish coming out of the water onto the land. It's beautiful evidence. It's elegant. I mean, they're lovely fossils. Go to Philadelphia and have a look at the wonderful fossil they've got there. I'm sure they have replicas in the Smithsonian here. Just look at that evidence. It's beautiful. The evidence for the transition between the reptilian jaw and the mammalian jaw. The reptilian jaw has several bones. The mammalian lower jaw has only one bone. And the other bones that were in the reptile have now moved into the inner ear. It's a beautiful transition.
So what is your cause in life? I would think that if your cause was to convince others that evolution is correct, not just a theory, but a fact, then you'd be devoting yourself to finding this information and making it readily available. What I find is that you're spending a lot of time arguing with me, trying to convince me, instead of showing the evidence or spending your time producing evidence.
Was I not just telling you about fish that are intermediate between the sea?
But again, what I go back to is if there was a large enough amount of evidence, which there should be. If we have gone from slime to human beings, there should be an overwhelming amount of evidence, not these isolated cases that could be interpreted differently. And see, one problem that evolutionists have is that in the past, when there's been great acclaim of a discovery to show from one species to another, it's been proven to be fraudulent. So evolutionists have a problem in their own history. The fact that there have been so many cases of fraud or misinterpretation of information that now we have a problem believing what you say.
There was the Piltdown Man in the 1920s. I suggest we forget about the 1920s and look at today. Go and look at some modern paleontology labs. Go and talk to some modern paleontologists. Go and talk to the people who are looking at the transition from fish to amphibians. Go and look at the fossils about the human transition. Look at the evolution of the horse. Look at the evolution of the elephant. There are evolution of the whale. There are so many beautiful stories. I mean, you'd be fascinated. You would think that these fossil histories are to the greater glory of God if only you go and look at them.
Would it make you happy if we were to agree that there is some evidence regarding macroevolution? Would that alone make you happy, or would you still be unhappy and feel that your cause is unsuccessful if many of us still believe that there's an intelligent being who caused this to happen?
It would make me enormously happy. I would love it. If you said, yes, 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 evolution is obviously a fact, I accept evolution, but God did it. I mean, that wouldn't, I mean, I wouldn't agree with that, but it would make me hugely happy. At least you looked at the evidence.
And I don't understand why that's so important to you, that I believe exactly like you believe.
No, no, it's not important to me. I am an educator, I'm a scientist, I'm a university professor, I teach. I love it when people see the beauty of nature, the beauty of evidence, and just look at it and appreciate how elegant it is. It really is beautiful. Go and look at it.
What is the danger in believing in an intelligent designer?
I don't think that's a danger. Well, as an atheist, which I am, a very strong atheist, I have a quite separate agenda. That is an agenda, but it's not my agenda as a science educator. I'm now talking purely as a scientist and a science educator, and I am distressed that somebody as intelligent as you is refusing to look at the evidence.
And what is your agenda as an atheist? Because that is going to influence the work that you do.
Well, I like to think it's not, actually, but whatever I might say about that, I've done another television program about that, and I was a very strong atheist in that program. This program is about Darwin, and there are many Darwinians who are not atheists, and all I'm talking about now is the factual evidence, and I'm suggesting to you that you might do a better job for your religion if you would open your mind to the factual evidence and realize that actually you could use the genuine scientific factual evidence to the greater glory of your God, rather than running away from the evidence.
But again, that's where we differ. We don't believe we are running away from the evidence, and what we are seeking to do is to help people to understand who God is, that He's a loving God, and part of His love toward us is that He created us, the fact that He wanted us to exist.
Maybe He did it via evolution, though.
And
what we feel as meaning and value that is a result of our entanglement with others. It's not that if we understood ourselves perfectly at the level of the brain, the result would be a total diminishment in our view of ourselves as wondrous and wondrously made. I mean, I think it would be. In some sense, it exalts our circumstance, and it would give us, whatever is true about us ultimately, it would give us a power to change our circumstance in ways that benefit us. I mean, people want to be happier. People want to be less burdened by unnecessary psychological suffering. How can we bring that about? Is delusion the only remedy? Delusion has its place. I mean, delusion actually works for some people some of the time, but it's not. It is a fragile remedy. Reality intrudes, and then your delusions are no longer helping you. And so it seems to me that we're continually going to be in a better position to figure out how to be happy together, and to see that our collaboration with one another is not zero sum. I mean, it's not like my happiness is predicated on your losing happiness. For the most part, as human beings, our happiness is predicated on us recognizing more and more of the time that we have a common project. And it seems to me that one of the challenges of science is to figure out how to to focus us on that common project with the least amount of friction, with the least amount of unnecessary, divisive, sectarian loss of resources, essentially. And when you look at the difference between science and religion in the way they break down or fail to break down boundaries between people, I mean, science is the greatest force for the removal of conversational barriers we have ever hit upon. I mean, there is no such thing as American science versus Japanese science. There's no such thing as Jewish science versus Hindu science. I mean, there's just science, and at some level that has to be true of ideas generally. It has to be true of the ideas that cash out our moral intuitions and our deepest goals in life.
So what's the mission statement of the Reason Project, which you're just starting, just in a very briefly?
Yeah, it really is along these lines. The goal is to spread secular thinking and scientific knowledge in society, and to do that in a very multidisciplinary way. I mean, to do it in terms of organizing conferences and funding scientific research, but also to create documentaries and media events. And we have a very diverse board, from scientists like Steven Weinberg to entertainers like Bill Maher and writers like Ian McEwan and Salman Rushdie. I mean, my image is this is a problem of transforming the way people think about the human project and transforming the kind of expectations we have of our neighbors for making sense in public discourse. And so I see a role for business and entertainment, and also hard laboratory scholarship to come at this from all angles, because we all have to start talking the talk from all sides very quickly here, it seems to me.
So what are the most salient mistakes you've made, and what did you learn from them?
Well, I didn't learn much, because one salient mistake was to talk about MDMA in an interview. So yes, I had an interview with the LA Times, and it was on track to be your standard interview, and the mention of MDMA became the atheist has his mind blown on MDMA interview. Right. So don't do that again. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I'm glad you avoided doing that again.
You can see.
It's really...
I think it's going well. I mean, there's many things I could rethink, but I'm very grateful for how it has unfolded, and I feel like I've done everything in the wrong order. I published 2 books before I finished my PhD, and I mean it's a weird, I'm in a weird
that's
position.
That's what your advisor said to me as well.
Right. So there's clearly a better way and a more efficient way to do some of these things, but I can't really complain.
What about this whole complexity issue, though? As I just said, we biologists will freely admit things are really, really complicated inside the cell. They're even more complicated when you have some training and understand the biology, unlike most of the creationists. So how do we explain that? Don't we have to resort to a creator? And we say, well, no, of course not. There's lots of things that are very complicated. I'll show you an example here. This is a photo from a beach up north, Rialto Beach in Washington State. It's one of my favorite places. I really recommend. Go ahead, take a vacation there. You'll love it. And this is a very common thing along beaches, even beaches in California. Driftwood. Have you ever looked at driftwood? You go on the beach, and I'm sure they bulldoze it away here, but in other states, it's left sitting there. You find these walls of driftwood between you and getting down to the beach. Real walls, very complicated walls. Look at all those logs just lying all over the place. This is, we can say, a wall. It has been constructed. Who did it? We know the answer. Natural processes did it. We don't need a designer to build this kind of wall. That what happens here is this is just the storm line. That storms come along, they push logs that are floating at sea up onto the shore, and this is the limit of where they push them and they pile up there, and they make these very complicated long walls that run for miles and miles and miles, and are interesting places with all kinds of bizarre things going on in them. I mean, these are habitats for various invertebrates, for birds, all kinds of things live in here. Bacteria, of course, are thriving on it, and you get these complicated shapes. This is complex. You simply can't deny it. That's a very complex thing. You know, if I turn if I turn the projector off, will you be able to draw it? No, because it's fairly detailed, all kinds of minutia involved in building this kind of wall. On the other hand, we're familiar with this kind of wall. So this is also a wall. It's one that we can recognize that has a specific purpose, that was built by human agents. And I'd have to say that of these two walls, which one is simpler? The human-built one. This is one of the things about agency, is that when we build things, we don't make them needlessly complex. We want to make them as simple and efficient as we can, unlike that driftwood wall. So there's a difference here. When we look at natural walls, what we discover is that natural things are built by chance and necessity. They're functionally unspecified. There's nothing that says that pile of driftwood is a wall. It just functions as a wall to us. But it's also got diverse other functions. And they all tend to be complex. In this sense, complex often means sloppy. But it's still complex. Artificial walls, on the other hand, are built with intent. They're functionally very specific. You know, you don't just get a bunch of bricks and some mortar and you randomly throw it around to build a wall. If you want to build a wall, you build a wall. And that makes them relatively simple. So this is a mistake they're making, is you can't use simple complexity as a measure of design. As another example, I know there are some academics here who are probably like me. You know, I start every school year and I go into my office and my desk is pristine and everything is neatly laid out. And if you want to see real complexity, come visit me around about December. And suddenly everything is overwhelmed with complexity. There's books and papers everywhere. And I swear to you, it's not by intent. I don't plan it that way. What it is a lack of planning that leads to this kind of complexity. Okay, what about real biology? Something more interesting than a pile of driftwood. Can we find instances of complexity building up in organisms, and can we say whether it's a result of design or something else going on? And I'm just going to give you one example because I don't want to be in the way of the beer. And this is one of my favorite animals. This is a choanoflagellate. Choanoflagellates are really cool, simple little protists. So that's the first thing I have to tell you. This is a protist. It means it is typically a single-celled animal. And what it does is it just sits there in the water column, and it's got this thing called a flagellum, which the creationists just love. Okay, well, there's a flagellum there, and it whips around, and what it does is generates vortexes of water currents that suck bacteria and other things that it might want to eat down toward that little collar of cells or collar of cilia that surround the flagellum. That's how it lives. It just slurps up the water, collects all the bacteria that stick to its collar, and it thrives. It does very well. This is a protist, and like it says there, it's not a metazoan. And a metazoan is simply things like us, multicellular animals. I think you would all agree with me that there is a difference in complexity between a protist and a metazoan, right? Okay, because if you're going to disagree with me, I'd have to stop and we'd have to lecture for an hour to explain this. And that will get in the way of the beer, so I won't. So anyway, we're multicellular animals. What does that mean? That means we are made up of collections of cells, large collections of cells that have to do multiple things, messages back and forth, basically telling each other what they're supposed to do. So you can imagine, for instance, there are messages flying around when you eat a candy bar. Insulin, you've all heard of that. We've got to have this stuff that's flowing around that tells cells whether it's okay to take up sugars or not. It's part of the business of cooperation. We got important signals going on during development. So during development, cells are sticking together, and then they're making decisions like, should I be a liver or should I be a kidney? And the way they have to do this is they talk to each other and they recruit their neighbors. And they say, okay, I'm going to be a liver. All my neighbors around you here, you're supposed to be livers too, liver cells too. So let's get together and cooperate and build an organ. And if any cell around there happens to want to switch on the kidney genes, we'll boot him out or tell him very strongly that he has to switch. But it requires communication. So we've got cell-cell communication going on all over the place. Now, these are functions that we think of as going on in us, all right? We're multicellular. What about quantiflagellates? They're single-celled. They don't have to do that stuff. They all have this free life just floating around independently, each cell doing its own thing. So you think, well, this is something new that has evolved in us. And here's a surprise. It's not new. That quantiflagellates have a lot of the machinery that are involved in this process. For instance, I'll mention just one example here. There's a protein that was thought to be characteristic of multicellular organisms, of multicellular animals, and that's a receptor tyrosine kinase. Makes you sound smart when you say these polysyllabic biological terms, doesn't it? Anyway, receptor tyrosine kinase, what it is basically it's a protein that sits on cell surfaces, and it binds to proteins in the neighborhood, so it's one of those communication agents. And then on the inside, it's got something called the tyrosine kinase, which sticks phosphate groups on other proteins and initiates a cascade of activity. So it's one of these cells that are involved in communication. It's getting signals from other cells, and it's telling the nucleus, telling the DNA what it's supposed to do. So this is what receives a signal, for instance, that, oh, my neighbors are all liver cells, so I'm going to activate these proteins, which will turn on liver genes, and we'll all be happy, and this will be a good neighborhood. We'll settle down and raise a family right here. So that's what this is for. Where did that come from, you might ask? Well, it turns out quantiflagellates have receptor tyrosine kinases. It kind of blew a few people's minds way back when, because receptor tyrosine kinases were thought just to be found in animals, multicellular animals. This is a characteristic of multicellular animals. Quantiflagellates are protists, they're not multicellular, yet they've got it. When they've analyzed this in some more detail, what they've discovered is an interesting history for this particular protein. How did you get this little protein? Well, if you look in plants and if you look in fungi, you find that they have tyrosine kinases, so they have the proteins that do that phosphorylation trick, and they're floating around inside the cell. And they have this other protein that sits on the surface called an epidermal growth factor. So it's a protein that's sitting on the surface and receives signals, but they're not tied together. And somewhere in the last common ancestor of quantiflagellates and us metazoans, there was an accident, a little glitch in the duplication of this gene, and it ended up fused. This is like peanut butter and chocolate, okay? Once upon a time, peanut butter and chocolate came together, and what you got was something new, a brand new protein that can do some interesting new things in communications between cells. So now cells can have this little receptor on the surface that can recognize their neighbors and can initiate a bunch of changes on the inside, and all these wonderful new features could then evolve. This is just one step in all the features that we evolved, but of course it arose in a single-celled protist. Okay, so those are receptor tyrosine kinases. Labs have now taken apart quantiflagellates. They've sequenced their genomes. They've pulled out all these interesting genes in there. And they found that there's a whole bunch of stuff that once upon a time we thought were unique only to multicellular animals. And there they are. They're inside quantiflagellates. So the receptor tyrosine kinase I just mentioned, and they're the ones that signal switches in gene activity. They also found cadherins. Cadherins are really useful in all of us. This is glue, okay? This is what, I mentioned that you have to have glue that holds your cells together. This is a special selective glue that you can tighten up or release by changing levels of calcium. So it makes development very flexible. And there it is. It's there in quantiflagellates. And they also have these things called integrins. Cells not only have to stick to other cells, but in us multicellular animals, we build complex internal environments. We secrete all kinds of proteins internally that make things like a cellular matrix, a protein matrix that cells can stick to. And they have special proteins dedicated to glomming on to these proteins and holding the whole structure together. And there they are in these protests. So the point is that we've got all this cool stuff going on inside. It's complicated, sure, but it's not as if a designer came along and said, well, we got to have multicellular animals, so we got to add all this machinery, all these tools, all these little fasteners and so forth to the genome so that they can stick together and build multicellular creatures. No, this was all stuff that was present earlier in single-celled animals.
The question of whether God exists or whether religion holds any inherent truth still, weirdly, remains an essential debate in humanity, despite the fact that one side is backed up by evidence and the other by anything but evidence. And I agree that religion has played a significant role in shaping society's moral frameworks and the individual lives. There is no denying that, man. But I think it doesn't actually matter given the amount of pain that has been exported around the world in the name of these same religions, man. But even if religion hadn't caused all this pain and had only had a positive impact on society, that wouldn't mean that it was true. In no other instance would we be okay to believe a lie simply because its outcomes are positive. So, guys, with that in mind, in today's section of this video, I will take a look at some of the most persuasive arguments against the existence of God and the foundations of religion that I've ever come across. The effort at the end of the day is to unweave and challenge the narratives that have fueled notions of divinity and faith. So, to begin, one of the most enduring arguments against the existence of God is the problem of evil. I'm sure most of you have already heard it. This philosophical dilemma questions how an all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-good God could allow suffering and evil to exist in the world. If God is truly omnipotent, he would have the power to eliminate evil. If he is omniscient, he would know about all the suffering that is going on around the world. And if he is omnibenevolent, he would desire to eradicate it. Yet, to this day, human suffering still exists on a massive scale, from natural phenomena and disasters that claim countless lives to human-inflicted atrocities like war, genocide, and violence. The existence of such suffering seems incompatible with the idea of a loving and just God. Now, philosophers like David Hume and Epicurus have famously articulated this problem, with Epicurus asking, is God willing to prevent evil but not able, which means he is not omnipotent? Is he able but not willing? Then he is malevolent. Is he both able and willing? Then where does evil come from? Is he neither able nor willing? Then why do we call him a God? This line of reasoning suggests that the presence of evil in the world is a strong argument against the existence of an all-powerful and benevolent deity. Now, I understand that Christians have always tried to make the argument that suffering is necessary to ensure that the human experience is worth it. But as Alex O'Connor recently pointed out in a video by Jubilee where he was against, I think, 25 Christians, that still wouldn't suggest why animal suffering is necessary. Another significant argument against the existence of God is just the sheer lack of empirical evidence in the world. In a world where scientific inquiry has provided explanations for phenomena once attributed to divine intervention, like simply flying or talking to people on the other end of the world, as I'm doing right now in an instant, the need for a supernatural explanation has diminished. The scientific method, which relies on observation, experimentation, and evidence, has consistently failed to provide proof of God's existence or any of his direct actions. Now, take the theory of evolution through natural selection that was offered by Charles Darwin. Such a simple theory was able to offer a comprehensive explanation for the diversity of life on Earth without invoking a divine creator. Similarly, the Big Bang theory provided a scientific account of the origins of the universe, rendering the idea of a creator God unnecessary. Now, while some might argue that God set these processes in motion, it still raises the question of who or what created God or set him in motion, leading to an infinite regress. And you know what? At least when science throws out evolution and the Big Bang, they have a trail of well-reasoned thought backing them up. Believers, on the other hand, just need to conveniently attach God to every scientific finding and they think they've won, man. Even if the scientific finding directly contradicts a long-held religious doctrine such as the theory of creation, they'll still somehow think placing God in every gap of scientific ignorance is a win for them, man. So yeah, the absence of empirical evidence for God's existence combined with the success of scientific explanations undermines the necessity of invoking a divine being to account for the natural world. So, next guys, the argument from inconsistency in religious texts and historical doctrines also poses a significant challenge to the validity of religion. Across different cultures and historical periods, countless religions have emerged, each claiming to possess the ultimate truth about the nature of reality and the divine. However, these religions often contradict one another in their teachings, rituals, and conceptions of God. For instance, monotheistic religions like Christianity, Islam, and Judaism worship a single all-powerful God. Actually, they all claim to worship the God of Abraham, but they never seem to agree on anything. The foundation of the Christian faith is that Jesus Christ is God. Quite literally, that is the cornerstone of the religion. That is something that both Muslims and Jews deny. So even in that one single case, all three religions cannot possibly be the truth, man. Not to mention that monotheistic religions like Christianity, Muslim, and Islam worship a single powerful God, while polytheistic religions like the Hindus, Greek religion, blah, 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 recognize multiple religions. Actually, I just remembered something, guys. Do you guys remember when Christopher Hitchens got William Craig to admit that Craig, believes that members of some Christian denominations are worshipping the wrong way and will end up in hell? Yeah, that was an amazing debate, man. Anyway, the point that I'm trying to make is these inconsistencies raise questions about the reliability of religious texts as sources of divine truth. If God were real, man, and had revealed himself to humanity, one might expect the consistent and unambiguous message to be the reality of religious fact, rather than the fragmented and contradictory collection of beliefs that we have across the sphere of the world, man. Now, take a look at the history of religion, ladies and gentlemen, and it's undeniable that religion arose as a quick fix to the psychological and sociological needs of human societies back then. Even more scholars today agree that religion arose as a way for early humans to make sense of the world and cope with the uncertainties of life, man. In ancient times, including in Africa, natural phenomena like thunderstorms, earthquakes, and diseases were often attributed to the actions of gods or evil spirits. In these instances, religion provided a framework for understanding these events and offered comfort in the face of suffering and death. Over time, though, religion beliefs became intertwined with cultural practices, social structures, and political power, reinforcing their hold on these same societies. As the anthropologist Pascal Boyer argued, religion is a byproduct of cognitive processes that have evolved for other purposes, such as detecting agency in the environment and forming social bonds. Now, from this perspective, religion is not a reflection of divine truth, but rather it is a human construct shaped by evolution and cultural forces to aid us in past uncertainties. Now, let's take a look at the moral argument against religion. While many people believe that religion is the foundation of morality, history and contemporary events demonstrate that religion can also be a source of division, conflict, and harm. Throughout history, ladies and gentlemen, religious beliefs have been used to justify violence, oppression, and discrimination. And we have multiple examples of these, from the Crusades, the Inquisition, and to the Salem witch trials. All these are examples of how religion can be wielded as a tool for power and control. Even to this day, religious extremism continues to fuel acts of terrorism and sectarian violence. And moreover, religious doctrines promote moral codes that are at odds with modern values, such as the subjugation of women, the condemnation of certain ways of life that bother no one, and the rejection of scientific progress. So, it stands to reason that morality doesn't require divine foundation, and that ethical principles can be derived from reason, empathy, and the human experience. We can't even take secular humanism, for instance, which advocates for a moral framework based on the well-being of individuals and promotion of human flourishing without recourse to supernatural beliefs.